Okay, do please take a seat for the third panel of the conference. Delighted to introduce our panelists, who are Mark Kelly from Western Sydney University, Alexis Carré from Princeton University, and Rossen Roussev from the St. Cyril and St. Methodius University of Veliko, Tarnovo. So they will speak in that order. The session is entitled War and Liberal Democracy, and Mark's presentation is War as Political Panacea on the Permanent War Economy.
Thanks.
You each have 15 minutes or thereabouts. I won't be too draconian, but I will cut you off after 20 at the very latest, to inject a little bit of illiberalism into the panel. Or post-liberalism, if you prefer, but we do want to leave plenty of time for the discussion. If there are any questions after each of the presentations, I'm happy to take one or two, just so that we keep the audience awake and engaged. This is the session after lunch, as we know, typically the hardest one of the day. So any questions to the presentations I'll take, and then we'll have more questions and discussion at the end of the panel. So Mark, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Adrian. Sorry for stepping in your introduction there.
Not at all.
Hi, I'm Mark Kelly. My paper is in the program, and Adrian announced it duly as War as Political Panacea, but I think really that's reflects me reaching for a thesis that's slightly too grandiose for what I can do in 15 minutes, and it also reflects the fact that I thought I might have more time when I put it in. Not that I'm ungrateful. In fact, I'm extremely grateful to be here, and probably it's best that I only have 15 minutes, so I can only give myself so much rope. My provisional title for what I'm actually going to say, if I were to revise it, would be, what does the national security state want? And the answer would be my original title, something like War as Political Panacea, Economic Panacea. What I'm trying to do here, schematically, is to tie together basically what I've been saying in pieces I've been writing in Telos over the last few years, which mostly have been concerned, certainly the longer ones, with domestic politics in the United States. But I've also written a few shorter pieces about international affairs, and more specifically US foreign policy. And bringing my attention to the topic of war, my thought was to try to kind of tie all this stuff together and talk about how what's been happening, or what I think has been happening in US domestic politics over the last 10 years has tied to US foreign policy, which really, to my mind, seems to continue more or less unabated. So what there seems to be is, if you look on the surface, is some kind of dramatic shifts in US domestic politics, specifically the election, and then what's the opposite of an election? Diselection? Ouster of Donald Trump, the last presidential election. So this saw US domestic politics seemingly lurch from right to left. US foreign policy was pretty continuous throughout that period. Didn't change too much. We can find lots of minor changes, of course. The main one, seems to me, is that Trump was relatively dovish. I think he's the most dovish US president we've seen in the last 40 years or so. And of course, the headline is that Trump is the first president in many presidents not to start a war, though he continued some. So, getting off foreign policy for a minute, I'll turn to my thoughts about US domestic politics, which are largely that we've seen in the last presidential election, 2020, a coalition of powerful interests in the United States come together more or less explicitly to get rid of Donald Trump. They've coalesced precisely around the figure of Donald Trump as a negative figure. And this alliance includes, obviously, the Democratic Party, but also corporate elites, almost the entire media, academia, certainly, and crucially, for what I'm going to say here, the national security state. And that's probably the bit of it I've said least about in what I've written prior to this. And the real goal of this coalition, as I see it, is to return the United States to what they see, what this coalition sees, as the normalcy in US politics that existed before Trump's election in 2016. But it's done this through putting into place a kind of new ideology, which, is, I don't particularly like this term, but it seems to be the one that's most often used. Wokeness seems to be the easiest way to describe this. Although I'll try and avoid using that term again, but it may come up. If anyone has, shout out if you have an alternative thing to call it. Sorry?
Tractor beam.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it has a certain gravitational pull at this point, right? So, yes, it's about doing that, but it's reorganized US politics as a result. Prior, obviously, to Trump's election, the GOP was like a major powerful interest in US politics. It remains, obviously a significant presence parochially. A lot of states, the GOP remains dominant through gerrymandering and so on, or just sheer demographic dominance. But overall in the United States, it's been pushed out and pushed to the margins, particularly because of corporate donations now flowing away from the GOP. The Democratic Party seems to be cemented now as the favoured party of a lot of establishment interests, specifically corporations and the national security state that 20 years ago clearly favoured the Republicans. So those two in particular, the media and academia, you could say we're pretty leftish already, but they've now come together with what used to be their bugbears, and certainly academics used to spend all their time complaining about the national security state, not perhaps using that term, but about the military and corporations. But now academia seem to be very happy with them. Perhaps not so much the military, but for example, the FBI became great heroes of the left suddenly during the Trump era. So there's been a kind of realignment or recoherence of US politics around this new coalition. The question then, for me here, turning to this question of war, is what does it mean that the national security state has suddenly come to ally itself with the left with such unprecedented alacrity? I don't think there's a previous instance. I'm trying to think, maybe testing my American history. I mean, maybe if we go back to FDR or something, we can find a certain point where the military was happy with the Democrats. But in general, this really goes against the grain of what we've seen the national security state do historically. Always it was the right, the Republicans, and white Christian America that was seen as the bedrock of the military and the institutions of the national security state. I keep using this phrase, national security state. What I should probably say, just to, as an aside, what I mean by this is I take the phrase national security state to refer to all parts of the state concerned principally with national security. So maybe this is a little bit of an eccentric definition, but that would be, by extension, all persons, organizations, including in the private sector, that directly depend on national security spending, which therefore, national security spending in the United States in toto is probably about $1 trillion a year, around 4% of the US economy, and the employees of the national security state construed relatively broadly with about 4 million people, or about 3% of the US full-time workforce. In absolute terms, I mean, obviously that's a lot of people, 4 million people, $1 trillion, but of course, relatively speaking, that seems like a fairly small segment of US society. But I think that belies the significance, the political significance of national security state for two reasons. One is that certain segments of the national security state are peculiarly positioned both within the structure and by their expertise to influence politics. Indeed, parts of the national security state have as their explicit mission to influence politics in other parts of the world, and I think there's every reason to believe that toolkit can be brought to bear in various ways domestically within the United States. So I think it's peculiarly positioned to be influential, and also that it has, and this gets on to my original eponymous topic, the national security state is peculiarly necessary to the functioning of the US economy en large. Now, this might seem like a trivial observation to talk about the role of the national security state in the US economy, because of course, US economy is a functional whole and it requires all of the components that exist within it. I mean, if the electricity generation industry didn't exist, the US economy would fall over. You could say it about all kinds of industries. You could say it about the financial services industry. However, I think the US economy has become dependent on the national security state in a really particular way, and this is because of the way it relates to the United States' relation to the rest of the world. what I'm tempted to call, but I feel like it would be unpopular, US imperialism, although that's a term I like to use, but I mean it in quite a technical sense, in a technical kind of Marxist sense. What I mean by that then is the way that the United States economically is, or at least has been, this is apparently becoming unstuck now, but has been since the Second World War the dominant economy in the world, and has shaped the world, at least, in the Cold War, of course, it didn't apply to the communist states, but shaped the world economy in the so-called free world around its influence to its own advantage in particular ways. And specifically, I'd talk about the way the US is able to run a considerable trade deficit. This has been going on now for close to half a century. The US has run a sizable trade deficit, and it's able to do this, of course. There's a lot to talk about here, and I won't go into all the details. I presume people are fairly familiar with it, but because the dollar is a reserve currency, because of the way global financial institutions are set up, the US has prodigious advantages in trade. I'm also quite a fan of the idea that there's something called unequal exchange, which occurs when all first world countries trade with countries in the third world, because the way labour is valued in different countries is vastly different. So what I mean by this is if the US imports something from China, it's very cheap relative to the same product what the same product would cost if it had been produced in the United States, because the value of labour in China is so much lower than it is in the United States. But this means that the US can get an enormous number of things from the rest of the world, really, to put it crudely, without giving anything like the same amount back. This is a hugely advantageous situation for the US, but here I get to the point, this is all underwritten by the United States' capacity to influence the rest of the world directly, and by this I mean, of course, various things, soft power influence, but the ability to determine what governments exist in other countries, and of course, ultimately, this all has to be underwritten, at least by the threat of war. The US national security state, in various ways, is what keeps the US hegemonic. Now, what I want to suggest, though, is that this is not necessarily a particularly good situation for the United States. This leads to a prodigiously large national security state, which came into existence after World War II, and not immediately after. Of course, in World War II, for the first time, the United States acquired a giant national security state in the form of the military it built up during World War II and associated intelligence services and so on. But in 1994, this was deliberately deflated. The United States demilitarized, or began to demilitarize, and this went on for a few years, led to a recession in the United States. But the United States then dramatically remilitarized by 1950 in the face of the Cold War. And since then, the US has maintained this so-called permanent war economy. The military-industrial complex came to have this prominent position in US public life and in the US economy. And the US came to have this relationship with the world, which was no longer as it had been, primarily one of, the US prior to World War II was a power that primarily produced, exported, had trade relations with the rest of the world, on a more or less equal basis, to US as a hegemonic power, at least within its own Western sphere of influence, that had got itself in the situation of having to, through its very large military budget, prop up its allies who couldn't defend themselves at this point. And when their prominent allies like Britain and France began their decolonization process, the US then had to deal with, supporting, propping up the post-colonial successor states to the British and French empires to keep its trade interests going. This led to the situation the US is in now, and after the Cold War, it ended up expanding its influence in other parts of the world previously had been closed to the United States. This is the structure of the United States now. It's a society which has developed to become dependent on a set of global relations and on the security state that keeps that set of global relations going. I don't think, I'll give you my kind of conclusion now, I don't think this is a particularly good situation for the United States. I don't think this is a good situation for the United States' domestic politics. Indeed, I think it's corrosive for it. And I don't think it's a particularly good situation for the world. It is one that I think now seems to be coming unstuck, which is not a pleasant process to go through, but it does seem that signal event here is China's economic power surpassing that of the United States. So for the first time in a very long time, there is an economic power that is larger than the United States in the world. It becomes untenable for the United States to continue to maintain its dominance in the same way. It seems pretty clear. We're now starting to see de-dollarization happening on a large scale. The spark for this, if you like, has been this conflagration in the Ukraine, but it's been a long time coming, and I think was likely to happen one way or the other. In this situation, this is my closing point about the national security state and saying what it wants, the danger I think we face, and this is both, for people in the United States from a certain direction and the rest of the world from another one, but it's the same dangerous situation, is what the national security state in the US, which has an inordinate amount of power politically and economically, will do. And ultimately, its own interests are primarily in propagating its own interest and its own hegemony rather than those of the United States at large. Now, these have been understood to correlate to a large extent, but I am dubious the extent to which that's really ultimately true, particularly whether the people of the United States are well served by that. So I think this is the dangerousness of the situation we see ourselves in now, where US hegemony is declining and the US security state has a situation where it is presented with an opportunity. And here I think of the security state really, this is reflecting my theoretical background. I'm not talking about individuals in this. This may be true of individuals in it, but it's the logic of the machine, if you like, the logic of the power structure itself. It will see the opportunity to expand its power by seeking opportunities to, for example, start wars, or at least continue them once they've been started. And yes, this is what concerns me.
Mark, well, thank you very much. You respected the 15 minutes impeccably.
That was an accident,
so that sets a great example for the rest of the panel, indeed the rest of the conference. Any questions to Mark, specifically at this stage? David?
I guess I'm
Or what?
kind of...
Sorry, I think we need a microphone, David, for our online participants and everyone else in the room.
So I guess I'm just wondering about how you sketched out a kind of new configuration in which sort of the Democratic Party, universities, national security state are all somehow in alliance now. And then at the end, you kind of, surmise that this, I'm not sure if I guess I'm wondering if you're surmising that this whole coalition is sort of all equally interested in, I guess, promoting warfare as a domestic policy, sort of, and whatever, industrial policy, and I'm wondering how you're separating that out. Yeah.
Thank you for that, David. That's the perfect question in that it points out exactly what I didn't say and should have. So, but that's great. You've seen the whole. No, I mean, in a sense, this is my question that I went into this starting with and then failed to answer, because the question in the background here is a question, and I hesitate to mention it because I feel it's going to be controversial, but it has been commented, and I believe this is true, that the extent of support by all the major institutions in US society for Ukraine in the war between Ukraine and Russia is unprecedented, or at least it's not something we've seen for a long time. It's certainly greater than the institutional support across society that there was for the war on terror, for example, which was much more divisive. So there's this much greater popular sentiment behind this. Now, I think a lot of people here would think that the reason for that popular sentiment behind the Ukrainian side is just because it's obviously right and good, and so on. But I think really what's happened here is that the creation of this alliance has allowed foreign policy to be kind of deputized in a way that it wasn't previously. So as long as things in the United States boxes seem to be ticked, and here I'm going to invoke this concept of wokeness again, which I managed to avoid till now, but as long as the people in the positions of power have, you're ticking the right diversity boxes, and you have people that, right diverse categories in leading positions, then domestic opposition is mollified. The Democratic Party, academia, the media think this is okay, and as long as this logic is then applied to external enemies, which it by and large is, because it's very easy and there's the basis there to do it, to say, well, Russia and China are hostile to LGBT rights or something like that. So this goes along with the logic of the coalition inside the United States.
Okay, I'll take Russell and Casey's question together, and then one answer from Mark, and we'll move on. I see lunch hasn't totally mobilized the audience. It's always good to see.
Okay, so this will overcome any kind of torpor after lunch. So I'll disagree with you on the ideological discussion around Ukraine, but that's really not your main point. Your main point seemed to creep in a side comment where you described, I think correctly, Trump as the most dovish president in a long time. Are you in fact suggesting a causation that this, I'll take a neutral term, Gleichschaltung of the American elite around a woke ideology is precisely a response to the threat of Trump's dovishness?
The short answer to that is yes. I mean, I have to give a slightly longer answer to that, which is that this is the reason that the national security state has flipped its allegiance from GOP to Democrats. That Trump won. Trump was. And this already happened in the 2016 elections. Very clear that basically Clinton was the NatSec candidate in 2016, and which in prior elections hadn't been as clear. Trump. I mean, the thing that I'm sorry. I apologise. I'm unnecessarily tall. That's caused problems in this situation.
and at the same time softly spoken, which is a rather interesting combination.
One is compensated
to the Australian, that's even more perplexing. But anyway, let's leave it there for the.
Well, I'm actually originally British, so that's the explanation for softly spoken. It's not.
That's right.
Yeah, we are.
That's right.
So this it occurred in this way that obviously this Trump coming, and of course Trump came in as an outsider candidate. The mainstream of the GOP clearly didn't want him there. They still are trying, and in the full version of my paper I talk about this. I kind of glossed over it, but it's very clear that the current situation, there's the kind of more swampy side of the GOP, the congressional side, are desperately trying to get back inside the tent, get the corporate donations back, get back in with the NatSec side. On the other hand, out in the sticks, the Trumpists are trying to do something else. And this makes the GOP a kind of wild card that they don't want to deal with. So that then has led to the national security state being now, I think, in a pretty secure relationship with the left side of US politics in a way that is really strange. There are other things going on here, I mean, though, which I would mention as factors. One is the demographic change in the United States in general. So it was a winning bet 20 years ago that you go, okay, this is going to be our recruitment pool for the military. This is going to be our base of support will be, white evangelical Christians. Numbers have dwindled to this point, and numbers of other groups have gone to the point where you can't anymore have that kind of bet in US politics, either at a political level or at a kind of military strategic level. And that's happened. And also there's been this really important change. I mean, if you really drill down, but this kind of wokeification of PMC, the new class, which has really fed through into the military officer corps, like very clearly, because they're college educated, now suddenly have a completely different set of values to the officer corps of 30 years ago. That's another really major factor.
Casey, and then, as I said, we'll...
Thank you. Sorry. Do you see any realignment changes, prospects from the dirtbag left or the dirtbag right?
No, I like Chapo Trap House. That was like 5 years ago. That would be my answer to that. I mean, but I guess maybe that's addressing the dirtbag left phrase rather than the point of your question. I mean, I think really where that's gone, this kind of like post-left formation, and this is very online stuff, right? I'm not sure how real world any of this is. And of course, I've been on board with this. I mean, I think what you see now is and I'm certainly a case in point of this, like people who were like dirtbag left have now become post-left and have now become right-wing. At this point, I would just consider myself a conservative now, not even like any of these other kind of like qualified left versions. But I think I'm not the only one. I think that's been the kind of the way people who don't like the way the left have gone with this, they've just ended up on by default on the right, because the moment you start questioning any of the major left chivalrists, they just call you a Nazi. So.
Dirtbag left mean something?
It was people, and it was there's this thing called no.
Right, I know there's another question. Is it okay if we take them later on? Because I fear that we're going to otherwise run out of time, and it'd be grossly unfair towards Alexis and Rossen. So, but please remember your questions, okay? And we will definitely make time for them at the end. So, Alexis, over to you.
All right. So after Mark's presentation, I feel I'll sound like I'm on the payroll of the national security state, but I promise I'm not. I'm doing this for free.
And he's French, so it's unlikely to be on the payroll of the deep state, I think. No? Well, it's certainly of the American deep state. We haven't talked about the French one.
So, democratic self-government is inseparable from a specifically modern self-understanding of power as we come to exercise it. By understanding power as being based on the consent of the governed, liberal democracies tend to exclude violence from the domain of rational action. In fact, liberal democracy can be described as the successful attempt to establish peaceful competition for power on one hand, and institutional arrangements to protect the governed from the arbitrary violence of the governing class on the other. Yet such a self-understanding doesn't limit itself to the internal constitution of the state, and the conditions of internal peace tend to appear as conditions for the establishment of peaceful relation between states. Such an approach to violence doesn't so much lead to its concrete extinction, as recent history shows, as to a certain incapacity to confront it. Conversely, the moral and political dispositions cultivated by virtue of that rejection of violence tend to affect the perception hostile power may have of democratic governments and the scope of actions that may be used to exploit what is seen as an essential weakness of these regimes. Concerned with that problem, Raymond Aron and Leo Strauss attempted to reassess our conception of practical rationality, understanding their effort as being part of an intellectual rearmament of democratic states in their struggle against totalitarian and authoritarian regimes. If the choices that have presided over the elaboration of the liberal political order appear radically problematic, if they reveal themselves to be the product of a decision on the basis of nothing, that is, in the words of Schmitt, of a simple act of the will which cannot bind the one who makes it when he happens to will something else, then the political order which had seemed coextensive to an irreversible historical process can no longer appear to us, as it did to Kant, under the form of a good which, once present, perpetuates itself. On the contrary, it takes the form of a historical order, itself subject to the accidents of history, war, or revolution. As Aron and Strauss sensed, through figures such as Sorel, Schmitt, or Pareto, the assertion of the indetermination of history was linked to the calling into question of a regime conditioned on the premise of progress. Through that assertion, one called into question the conditions of possibility of the specifically bourgeois domination and its characteristic aversion to violence to the benefit of discussion and law. I'm quoting Sorel here. A social policy grounded in bourgeois cowardice, which consists in surrendering to the threat of violence, cannot but introduce the idea that the bourgeoisie as an elite is doomed, and that its destruction is nothing but a matter of time. Each conflict which gives rise to violence becomes a vanguard fight, and no one can predict what may come out of such confrontations. The great battle may always be around the corner. Each time we fight, it is the great Napoleonic war, the one that crushes the enemy for good, that the workers hope for. Thus emerges, through the practice of strikes, the notion of a catastrophic revolution. End of quote. Indeed, observed from the point of view of historical consciousness, liberalism now appears as hanging on a thread, that is, on the capacity of the will that wills it to submit the wills that work towards its destruction. And how can we not believe in the necessary defeat of liberalism if what Schmitt calls its will to neutralization makes it incapable to identify its enemies and to motivate the efforts and sacrifices that are necessary to defeat them. By showing the voids hidden behind the veil of progress, historicism thus makes us realize our situation, the situation of weakness of liberalism. As Aron declared in 1939, on the eve of a world war towards which he knew democracies were coming unprepared, quote, "The political and historical optimism of the 19th century is dead in all countries. It is out of question today to salvage the humanitarian and pacifist bourgeois illusions. The excesses of irrationalism do not disqualify, quite the contrary, the necessary effort to call into question the progressivism and abstract moralism of 1789. Democratic conservatism, as well as rationalism, can only be saved if they renew themselves." End of quote. Neither Strauss nor Aron saw the repetition or perfection of the philosophy that had presided over the elaboration of the modern project as a viable answer to the radical questioning introduced by historicism in our practical universe. Both admitted that a rational defense of the liberal order had to take that critique seriously, if it were not to entertain the same illusions that had led liberal democracies on the brink of total destruction in their struggle against Nazi Germany. Both undertook a moral and political refounding of our regime on the basis of that impartial examination of its most radical critiques. In that context, Schmitt undoubtedly occupies a central place for reasons I'll try to briefly outline. Let's start by saying that both Aron and Strauss were very much aware of Schmitt's thought. Citations and more often allusions are frequent in their works. Indeed, Strauss went so far as to say in the American preface to the English translation of his book on Spinoza that his engagement with Schmitt in the early 30s, on the occasion of his review of the notion of the political, had led him, not entirely by accident, to reassess the possibility of a rediscovery of ancient political philosophy, something which would become his lifelong work. Such a rediscovery certainly wasn't Schmitt's own project. One would rather have to say that certain aspects of Schmitt's thought, as opposed to other thinkers of the German conservative revolution, pointed to that problem that Strauss went on to address. Through his critique of pacifism and normativism, Schmitt exposed modern natural rights and the institutions which were knowingly or unknowingly premised on it to their contradictions. By grounding obedience in the primacy of right, Hobbes had initiated a movement which, according to Strauss, found its fullest expression in Kant's project of perpetual peace. A project, one may say, which finds one of its instantiations in the hopes raised by the post-Cold War globalization, which is unraveling today. Far from being a possible resource in Schmitt's critique of liberalism, as Schmitt certainly hoped for, Hobbes was in fact the true founder of liberalism, according to Strauss. Despite the authoritarian elements of his political philosophy, all subsequent political developments of modernity derive from that first great rupture, which consists in his assertion of the primacy of the right to self-preservation. The grounding of political obedience in that right meant that obedience was in fact, and naturally so, never unconditional. And although Hobbes granted his sovereign a large authority, that capacity to be obeyed only went so far as the natural capacity of the will, the sovereign will, to produce effects. It stopped at the limit constituted by the essential secrecy of consciousness, or to put it differently, at the physical body. For the same reason that human motives, which are the prevail of that secret consciousness, are essentially unknown, they can be no foundation for the state, the modern state, and of no concern to its activity. Hence was born the idea of the modern neutral state. Schmitt himself will admit after his dialogue with Strauss in the early 30s that the secrecy of consciousness was the grain of sand whose presence, from the beginning, predicted the eventual falling apart of Hobbes' Leviathan. The type of relation that Hobbes instituted between the sovereign and the subject rests on a paradox. For there is no right or security to be won or earned from the sacrifice in obedience to the state. That is the reason why, from the start, Hobbes' project and the paradox at its heart can only find a coherent solution in the establishment of relations between states grounded in law. Such a transition can only be envisioned on the basis of anthropological and historical assumptions, namely on the philosophy of progress. The rise of radical historicism and political nihilism in the 30s displayed the illusions and contradictions behind such a project, a situation which Schmitt was well aware of and tried to expose through his own reflection on exception. What Schmitt is thinking through the mediation of the theme of exception is precisely the missing piece of normativist theories of law in their incapacity to understand man as man. Namely, these, I'm quoting Hobbes, and Hobbes quoted by Schmitt, accidents of person, not of institutions, without which institutions cannot function. The same remark could be made about the concept of charismatic leader in Weber. Both are attempts to think the legitimacy of command and obedience, where general norms or rational institutions are no longer sufficient to administer the interaction of agents, or, in the case of the second concept, explain it. In the situation of exception becomes visible for Schmitt the personal source of authority behind the veil of general rules and neutral institutions. But because he adhered to the contention of the modern science of man, because he remained a student of Weber, Schmitt could not think the extra-legal authority within the frame of the questions towards the natural hierarchy of human motives, the question of natural right, as Strauss pretended to have rediscovered. He had to resort to hostility as a real or concrete substitute to natural duties. What does the enemy, in Schmitt's account, if not place us in a situation where we have to sacrifice for the law under which we are, or submit? It is through the enemy, in fact, that the law finds the absolutely binding character that it doesn't have on its own and cannot find in reason. Schmitt points, as I said, in the direction of the problem, the inescapable problem of intention, that is, of the role of the individual agent and its motives in the heuristic situation of exception, but in fact in any situation where the law is mobilized. Schmitt points to that question but does not really address it, leaving the decision in favor or against of the Constitution to blind will. He is bound to think such situations on the basis of necessity. Yet necessity only exists for the agent, and therefore within the horizon of meaning of the agent, a horizon which is structured by moral categories. Since, as Aaron claimed, conscience is part of the reality to be explained in the case of political science, that reality cannot be grasped independently of the point of view of the agent, that is, of the categories by which man as an agent relates to that reality as the object of his actions. It cannot be grasped, in other words, independently of the practical motives by which the agent sees and justifies to others his own action as a consequence not of blind causes, but of practical and moral choices, which capture both a certain intention or end, as opposed to others, and a certain set of dispositions that make this end good and desirable for such an agent, worthy of pursuit for me and others. When thinking about the possibility to use violence, it is not indifferent to us to know whether the person in front of us is trustworthy or untrustworthy, rash or moderate, humane or cruel. Placed in the exact same situation, faced with the exact same necessity or appreciation of that necessity to use violence or abstain from it, will vary depending on the answer to those questions. Our failure to judge situations and people, our misuse of violence, in no way disproves the importance and the reality of the moral qualities or moral categories through which we try to find orientation in our action. Given the concentration of the means to use violence in the hands of the state, this observation led Strauss and Aron to stress the importance of the moral character of the ruling class, which in each regime is shaped by its constitution, ideology, and political culture. The incapacity of general, neutral, and impersonal rules and institutions to exhaust the task of the political, made particularly visible in their failure to deal with political violence, of which war is the extreme form, testified to the necessity to rethink and refound our regime with a view to the practical virtues without which it may fall prey to powerlessness or injustice. In so doing, Strauss obviously, but Aron also, resorted to the liberal education provided by the political philosophy of antiquity. That such an approach may be useful to inform liberal democratic politics especially appears in the case of Aron, who was, much more than Strauss, a commentator of the politics of his time. It is first obvious in the case of subversive warfare. The totalitarian movements or authoritarian movements who claims the benefits of the rights they intend to suppress can never really be understood or suppressed from the point of view of neutral institutions or general norms. You need to get into their heads and understand their motives. But it also plays a crucial role in the case of foreign policy. Peace and War Among Nations, one of Aron's main book, was, among other things, an attempt at devising a moral political psychology of governing elites and how it should affect the relation between regimes. Such a lesson is as crucial today as it was in pre-war Europe. If anything, globalization has taught us that the diminishing uncertainty owed to the rationalization of mainly economic processes is in no way followed by diminishing political risks or need for morally demanding political decision. Rationalized processes surely allow us to draw better predictions about the prosperity and decline of certain countries or economic sectors. But the certainty, say, of Chinese economic supremacy in 50 years or the role of Russia in maintaining low energy prices in Europe in the next decades only increases the uncertainty regarding the political meaning of that supremacy, as recent events in Hong Kong, Taiwan, or Ukraine demonstrate. Political relations, as Aron cared to remind us, do not depend in the final analysis on causes that make men act, but on motives men choose. It mostly depends on what goals the Chinese and Russian ruling classes are ready to pursue thanks to that increasing power, and what means they're ready to set forth in so doing. It depends, in other words, on the moral constitution of Chinese and Russian regimes. While following Schmitt in his critique of legal normativism and the illusions of progress, when it came to carrying out the task of understanding what exception may demand from us, as opposed to the way it is portrayed in rule of law thinking, Aron Strauss departed from him in thinking that Aristotle would prove at least as useful as Machiavelli in thinking the type of actions that it would demand from us.
Thank you very much, Alexis. Like Mark, that was absolutely perfect in terms of the 15-minute delivery and just as interesting and provocative as well. Questions to Alexis? David? Microphone's coming.
Thank you very much. So I guess I was a little bit unsure about your treatment of Schmitt and Hobbes with respect to that what you referenced when you referenced Schmitt talking about that liberal kernel of Hobbes that kind of undermines the system. So are you arguing then in the end then that that Schmitt becomes a sort of a less liberal Hobbes in the sense of rejecting that kind of liberal focus on security, really, and moving toward a kind of more I guess moralistic kind of state, because there's a kind of I mean, I think there's an ambiguity in Schmitt there, obviously, right? Because he emphasizes that security aspect, really I think in the Leviathan book, right? And but it does seem to contradict kind of the whole state of exception thing, the whole decisionism thing. So I was wondering where you stand on that exactly. I wasn't sure.
So yeah, I mean, sorry. Oh. I'm breaking this. Oh, sorry.
No, don't worry. You just carry on with the microphone.
So yeah, I'm taking this from so during the 30s, Strauss wrote this long review of the notion of the political, and Heinrich Meyer wrote this book, The Dialogue. I don't know the name in English actually. The Dialogue Between Absentees. I mean. You see the book I'm talking about, and he made a sort of genealogy of how Schmitt understood Strauss's critique. It's in that review that Strauss makes the quite surprising claim that Carl Schmitt is trapped in the systematic of liberal thought. And some have argued within the Straussian scholarship on Schmitt that and certainly that's what Meyer is saying, that as a consequence of this, Schmitt departed from in his appreciation of Hobbes in his later writing. And that's certainly the case in his Leviathan book, where he credits Strauss. I think that's one of the only times where he quotes he says that Jewish wise man or something like. He has a strange way of describing Strauss, but I think the source of this shift in his appreciation of Hobbes certainly is Strauss. And it appears in that comment that I quoted. I didn't mention that it was from his Leviathan book, but that this question of the division between interiority and exteriority was the grain of sand that would make the machinery of the Leviathan break apart. And so I'm kind of lost in my train of thought now, but I think, have I answered your question?
Well, I was just wondering whether you're seeing that as Schmitt's position, or whether you're saying, oh no, that forces Schmitt to move toward a more kind of radical notion of the Leviathan that does not allow for that liberal moment.
Mm-hmm. So I don't even think that Schmitt remains, in the. I don't think the Leviathan bears such a mark in his later works. I think his reaction to Strauss's critique is a departure from decisionism and a move towards what he calls thinking according to a concrete order. And that's an attempt, I think, to a more serious attempt to think the content of the norm as it is instantiated through the sovereign will. So I don't think you can say in his later works that this decision is, it might be groundless, but it is not a decision on the basis, it's not longer a decision towards nothing or on the basis of nothing. Because, and that's what you find in the Nomos of the Earth. So an attempt at a historical extraction of political norms, political and legal norms. But maybe we have a translator of Schmitt here, so.
We have the same transition, Schmitt's thinking, in the Argent, about the importance of culture.
And so my reading of Schmitt is instrumental in that paper and in my dissertation, which was basically on the same subject. It's I think both Strauss and Aron's Schmitt allowed them to see something in the legal and philosophical justification of liberal democracy that prompted them to try and find other philosophical sources for the justification of that regime. And for Strauss, it's clear it's ancient political philosophy, but my reading of Aron is that it's the same source.
Thank you. The next question to Alexis is by Marsha.
Thanks. I think I'm trapped in a Schmittian contradiction.
You can make a Schmittian exception to wearing the mask.
It's exactly.
Sorry, it's a very cheap dig.
No, that's a moment of decisionism. Right? But I wanted to further the question that David asked just now, but on the Hobbes side rather than on the Schmitt side. And it's because Hobbes is used and abused for many things, including ignoring his position that the so-called Leviathan state is there to prevent violence, and under other conditions, the individual has an enormous amount of breadth of individual freedom in education, in economic, child rearing, marriage, and even private religious belief. So that it's very difficult for careful readers of Hobbes to use Hobbes as a justification for systemic totalitarianism, because Hobbes's position is not about systemic leviathans. And so I was wondering now, given that, so that we don't suppress that as it often is, but given that, how do you use Hobbes and to include that point in your development of your thought? And on Schmitt, yeah.
Well, it's music to my ears because, as I said, Strauss is probably the most consistent advocate of an interpretation of Hobbes as the founder of liberalism. So I think his treatment of Hobbes, especially in his first book on Hobbes, clearly points to that. And if you've read that particular book, his argument is essentially that you cannot interpret Hobbes as attempting to apply modern natural science to the problem of politics, which would be, I think, necessary to have the totalitarian interpretation of the Leviathan. What Strauss is saying is that the rupture with ancient natural law intervenes before Hobbes discovers modern natural science, that it is an intrinsically moral break from the former tradition, and that break is the concern for application, the applicability of morality, and that's what prompts Hobbes to base obedience on the primacy of rights, because in the case of most men, most of the time, the offering of that right, the securing of that right to self-preservation, will produce obedience and will actually enable the individual rationality that is impossible in the state of nature. What is the state of nature if not individual rationality left alone? So institution is what makes the individual rational, I think, in Hobbes. But for the sake of that individual freedom, that is the indifference to motives, institutions can only obtain obedience by being indifferent to these internal motives of action. So it's essentially the state administers means, not ends. And I think that's essentially the ground for Strauss describing Hobbes as the true founder of liberalism.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexis, and thank you also for the questions. With one eye on the time, I think we're going to move on to the third and final presentation, but after which, again, there will be time for questions to that presentation and indeed to the whole panel. So, Rossen, over to you.
Yes, thanks. Okay, my paper is titled Critical Thought, Truth and Political Action, subtitle between Fake News, War Justification and Argument for Pacifism. Could be able to fit within this...
could you possibly put the microphone really...
Okay, to be able to fit within the 15 minutes, I will read some parts of it and then I will have to wrap up the rest. So I start with reading. I just want to warn that from the very beginning that some of the things that I might say, many of you might find very trivial, but in the end, I promise you, I'm going to be making a postmodernist argument. So,
good heavens, postmodern. That's still a thing.
Okay. In time of excessive pessimism, when statespersons and politicians all too often fail to ensure peace, stability, and prosperity on the planet, by means of their governmental power, or so to speak from above, there is still one major resource which can be utilized to achieve this goal rather from below, and which I would like to defend here as a source of optimism and against the skeptics. My word is about our individual critical thinking and its fundamental connection to what in the cultural tradition we call truth and action. For this particular connection can ensure that our capacity to think come up with informed decisions also on political choice and action, as well as with insight into the closely related topics of fake news, war justification, and argument for pacifism. Critical thinking is a part of a broader perspective of critical reflection, which in the intellectual tradition we have come to associate most commonly with the Kantian critical philosophy, Marxist political economic critique, the critical social theory of the Frankfurt School, the critical literary theory of structuralist and post-structuralist variety, but also generally with all philosophical and humanistic insights that could gain any relevance in the contemporary culture. Critical thinking in its widest sense is a thoroughgoing reflective thinking that is applied to issues and problems which may vary in their character from theoretical, practical, professional, and personal to political. This means that critical thinking is expected to be applied in one way or another in all compartments of what Jürgen Habermas has differentiated as the level of expert culture and the level of everyday communication practice. In its everyday practical sense, critical thinking is applied to solving specific problems, and in this its role, it typically includes three main steps. First, analyzing, rationalizing, and defining the problem. Second, formulation of a strategy or approach for solving the problem. And third, application of this strategy in solving the problem in practice. In this its role, critical thinking also inevitably involves creative thinking, which comes to respond to the need of innovation and adaptation of our knowledge to any new and unique problematic situation. Critical thinking, with its inherent creative aspect, is indicative of the fact that the problem-solving capacity of the human intellect operates in a qualitatively different manner from any other such capacity, including that of a machine. Thus, critical thinking requires from the critical thinker or problem solver a certain level of self-knowledge, including what cognitive scientists call metacognition, or what educational scientists call knowledge of how one's personal cognitive abilities work, which is a kind of personal epistemology and something that I have elsewhere discussed as philosophical competence. In addition to the complex problems, also demand expert knowledge, including multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary knowledge, to be available to the problem solver in the process of applying critical thinking. Indeed, it is utilizing a combination of expert knowledge and philosophical competence in the process of successfully solving a given problem that our thinking manifests itself as critical and creative. A key element of the work of any critical thought is its truthfulness. Without relying on truth as the only stable ground on which it could possibly step to move forward, critical thinking simply could not function to achieve its goal, as it would actually deceive itself and fail to solve the problem it faces. The truth, then, is an indispensable characteristic and thus a necessary aspect of any thinking that is adequate to and efficient in problem solving. It is the cornerstone whose search and assertion inaugurate the justification of all knowledge. In this regard, it is very indicative that in its role as a criterion for all knowledge, truth appears as a fundamental and definitive characteristic not only of what might be typically associated with epistemic culture, but also of the entire culture. The truth thus has the status of a fundamental socio-cultural value, which underlies the Western and other cultural traditions, including as the basis of every scientific and technological, ethical and legal, aesthetic and artistic, as well as executive and political culture. In this its sense of a value, the truth is also involved in the discussion of making sense and evaluation of our actions and cultural achievements, including in the sphere of politics. Critical thinking and its truth then can be understood as necessary conditions for any successful problem-solving activity, including in the political sphere, where this activity takes the form of a political action. Most certainly, the problems arising in the political sphere are typically complex, requiring a multifaceted expert knowledge, critical thought, and creativity. Their solving, however, requires critical thought also to adhere to certain values, since the complex nature of these problems cannot be adequately understood solely on the basis of the knowledge of the natural sciences. Hence, the discussion and formulation of values with regard to problems arising in the socio-political sphere and politics becomes necessary, with the fields of social sciences and humanity playing a key role here, ideally underpinned by a thoroughgoing critical theory. Thus, in the general case, value perspectives are backed up conceptually and constitute a fundamental and indispensable aspect of any ethical, juridical, and executive political culture, and likewise of the justification of every political action. As with any problem-solving activity, the critical thinking overseeing political action is understood from the very beginning as problem-oriented, that is, as aiming in each case to solve a specific problem. Likewise, this thinking is also expected to go through the above indicated 3 steps, which applies to both the main subject of political action, the problem solver who has assumed responsibility and the role of main executive factor in solving the problem, but also it applies to the supporters of these executives at all socio-cultural levels. It also applies to those who will try to make an assessment, political, legal, moral, ethical, economic, historical, of this action that would be impartial and objective. Here I will try to apply this approach to the political role of fake news, the widely circulated justification of the current war in Ukraine, but also to other wars, and also the argument of pacifism. Critical thinking and fake news. I will start my discussion with the statement that fake news is not news at all. This statement is indeed ambiguous, but its clarification will give us a sense of the context in which the socio-cultural role of fake news can be properly understood. Fake news is not news at all could mean that fake news are nothing new on the horizon of information, as well as that they are not news in a literal sense, but by virtue of being fake or of compromising the value of truth. Unlike true news, whose goal is perceivably less targeted and more of an information for the sake of information, fake news distribution appears to be more focused and playing a part in achieving very premeditated political goals, which could also be, of course, not necessarily nice. But fake news is also different from what are sometimes said to be different interpretations of certain events in different news perspectives, which are typically assumed to be more or less true, even when they appear to be completely opposite to one another. In all these cases, however, what appears to characterize most of all, and thus to differentiate the fake news as such, is the deliberate sacrifice of truth as a criterion for the value of the news itself. The sacrifice of truth, however, is not simply a symptom of the so-called post-truth world we are sometimes said to be living in today. For the post-truth world, nevertheless, never ceases to have a recourse to truth, not only because it verbally defines itself to truth, but because even when it tries its best to cover the truth up or to annihilate it entirely, it does so by presenting us with something else as true. Thus, it inevitably relates to truth and so is in fact fundamentally determined by and dependent on truth as well. Rather, the post-truth world is characterized by the fact that it is possible to present the truth in it in ways that are incompatible, without these being taken as an all too important event, because in this world expectations are for multiple perspectives to begin with. This indeed often has to do with what thinkers like Horkheimer and Heidegger have described as instrumentalization of truth in terms of reason or language. But the incompatibility of truth is sometimes different from the altogether sacrifice of truth that characterizes the fake news. Sacrificing the truth rather excludes it deliberately by doctoring it, by consciously replacing it with non-truth, whose instrumentalization is a far greater concern. We need to emphasize here that this substitution, precisely because it's being deliberate, is not, is in at least one sense true, namely as true untruth or as untruth, that is aimed to be presented as truth. And thus, we cannot exclude the truth pretty much in any possible definition, from any possible definition of any possible culture. So the total sacrifice of truth can only be illusory, and it cannot be done. Even when it is done. The post-truth world is always true post-world, and socioculturally and thus fundamentally, the truth always has the last word. This word cannot be simply taken away from it. I will wrap up the rest of the text. I discussed several examples of fake news. They're trivial enough to be understood quickly. The case in which recently in a deepfake Ukrainian president, that happened actually last year, was presented to show, to admit of his failure and to basically call on his soldiers to lay their arms, was very basically is well known. It is clear that it is a fake news, but I offer a more thorough analysis on why it is, because, for instance, the voice is different, because there are different pixels in the image of the president, because also his composure is not like what it typically is, and so forth. We have also seen other such fake news, and they are sometimes accepted as true only on the basis of not sufficiently enough critical assessment on the part of the receptor. Here I make a reference to René Descartes, who actually with his classical rationalist skepticism has given us an example of a critical thinking which is never put to rest until a certain indubitable point is found. I move on then on the war justification, and I again focus mainly on the Ukraine war. Here basically the argument given, the rationale basically given, which is in a way a justification, and I believe that we should pay attention to what politicians say motivates or justifies their actions. Basically, the idea of the denazification of Ukraine, that Ukraine is a Nazi country which is held hostage by a certain group of Nazis and so on, neo-Nazis, and then that it has to be denazified. The idea here is basically that critical thinking is applied to analyze the political situation in Ukraine to some extent, pointing that, first of all, the far-right political parties didn't gain more than 2% of the elections, of the last two elections, and much less, in fact, on the presidential elections in Ukraine. So this is clear. Then the comparison with the Nazi is also inappropriate for the president who has lost his relatives in the Holocaust, who is himself a Jew, and also the state of Israel, with its well-known policy of searching for and persecuting runaway Nazis, actually has announced its support for the president of Ukraine. So these are just quick arguments against this fakeness that is presented in this news.
Rossen, about one minute or so.
Okay, good then. Then I briefly discuss the possibility for justification of war that is supposed to be valid. I pretty much exclude some of the main cases in which somebody could come up with a good argument for war, and instead focus on the argumentation that politicians actually give for their participation in war. And then in the end I make an argument for pacifism, drawing mostly on Kant's critical philosophy and his idea of perpetual peace, but also on Lyotard's notion of the postmodern as focusing on plurality and therefore, in a certain sense, giving justice to the single and particular individuals. I believe that we could actualize the capacity of the single individual for critical thinking, and that single individual with this, his or her capacity could vote out the politicians from office who are actually not doing their job properly or who are basically lying. And of course, this is a more complicated situation. There are a lot more things to be said here, but generally I believe that, and I maintain it, that critical thinking, which unfolds around the concepts of truth, goodness, justice, and traditional concepts of the Greek virtues, and also of Kant's categorical imperative, they kind of come together here. And also by certain Gadameryan interpretation of the concept of good as something that motivates our thinking and our critical thinking, therefore, and also where we want to head at. I somehow maintain that we should admit of democratic politics, of social and environmental justice, and of human rights, and all these things that we think are very nice, and we all stand up there for them. That's pretty much what I wanted to say.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so questions to Rossen in the first instance, and then the whole panel as well. So who would like to go first? Russell.
Thanks for John. Thank you. I wish you could try to give a clearer understanding of what we might mean by fake news. In recent experience, we have cases of extraordinary fraud, obviously fake. But fake news is also often used as an epithet to denounce almost any other opinion with which you disagree or with which mainstream opinion disagrees. For example, at the height of COVID, anyone talking about ancillary costs of lockdown, that is, what's going to happen to the kids who don't go to school, were accused of disseminating fake news or disinformation. That's clearly very different from a fraudulent deep fake of a person. Can you help me think through, sort of philosophically, conceptually, how we could differentiate between these two cases?
I mean, most generally, I believe that it has to be a consistently applied critical thinking that could sort out whatever is fake news from, let's say, deep fake. Generally, it is clear also that there are sometimes different interpretations from different...
Rossen, the microphone, just much closer, please.
There are different interpretations from different news perspectives, for instance, that could be even incompatible. And I believe that these, in these cases, these interpretations have not sacrificed the truth as what is, as what more or less validates them as news. Whereas in the deep fakes, truth is generally sacrificed. Truth is sacrificed. It is simply abandoned. It is deliberate sacrifice, which I think the person who did it simply cannot reject it as true.
Jay.
I'm wondering if you're familiar with the philosopher Harry Frankfurt's distinction between lying and bullshitting, where lying requires, maybe paradoxically, some kind of respect for and even knowledge of the truth. Whereas bullshitting is a kind of heedlessness of the truth. It might as well not even exist. And, when we look at fake news, often I don't see anything like specific fraud or intentional dissemblance or something like this. I see something more along the lines of what Frankfurt calls bullshitting, which is just shooting from the, specifically what Trump was so good at, shooting from the hip. Doesn't matter if it's true or false. His aim is different, in other words. It's more maybe what Nietzsche would call an aesthetic aim, if you're talking about truth as a value. So I wonder if you could comment on that.
Well, I think that fake news could be something that is really something like bullshitting. It could not be really aiming at something too specific to be achieved. Just could be just done for no particular purpose. But fake news, in fact, could serve politics, and in these cases, they are actually quite deliberately and targetedly used. We have seen a lot of these, and I tend to blame the rise of the far right, for instance, to a large extent on these fake news, because people who are trying to make justifications on certain political, for instance, on war or other political events, just do not make the effort to think deep enough, and critical thinking is required. Sometimes people simply take for granted certain things, and fake newsers who are politically motivated, they have probably also studied how human mind operates, and that large amount of the people simply believe their friends or what they get on the Facebook, all kinds of memes and open lies, basically. Some people apparently don't even make any effort to adjudicate whatever they get as a news. And that's why I actually think that we need to apply critical thinking. The bullshitting, I don't think it's so at least dangerous at the moment. Maybe it will become later on. But the fake news, I think it is.
We have a request from, now it's from David, Marsha, and Joe. So let me take those three questions together, and then we'll see whether they relate only to the last presentation or maybe to more than the last. And we've also got a gentleman there behind you. Okay, so David, Marsha, Joe together, and then we'll have another round.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm wondering about the category of critical thinking, because it does seem to be maybe overly general, I suppose, right? I mean, we heard a presentation from Arya Budwinick this morning that really talked about a kind of thoroughgoing rationality that ends up kind of having to cancel itself and really end up with a kind of faith. And I'm wondering, I mean, I guess, that suggests that critical thinking is not equal to critical thinking, is that there can be obviously different, different parties that all apply critical thinking but come to different conclusions, right? And I mean, your discussion of fake news tries to reduce that by saying, oh, here's some objective criteria, in terms of historical fact. But beyond historical fact, there are, I think, different positions that you can defend with critical thinking, but they're incompatible. And I'm wondering how you react to that, or how do we deal with that in terms of this category of critical thinking?
Thank you for this question. I think it's very important.
Yeah. Thank you. Marsha, and then Joe. Wait, we will take them together.
Three questions.
Yes, thank you.
Adrian, I have a question that does not pertain only to the last speaker.
That's fine. We'll take them together anyway, because we've got about 10 minutes, so we need to...
Okay, so this is actually for Mark, picking up on the point that Russell began to ask. Of course, you knew that someone would. Regarding Trump, is he dovish? What is he, was he, whatever, dovish or Putin-ish? In other words, is that a consistent foreign policy or something more particular and personal? And I have two prongs to ask you about that. I mean, he wasn't exactly soft and cuddly regarding China, and one wonders if he was if the apparent, quote, dovishness is part of his domestic campaign rhetoric as opposed to actual policy, tapping into the sense of resentment, abandonment, and other duresses from the base. Therefore, we have to focus on MAGA, making America great again, return, and that can look like a foreign policy dovishness, right, because it feeds a kind of populist resentment, but in fact is not foreign policy dovishness. And of course, here I am distinguishing between campaign sloganeering and actual policy. The second prong, the second prong of that same question is, of course, that dovishness or pacifism is not only about the absence of war, it's about building peace. And I wonder how Trump can be described as a peace builder given his own belligerence and his encouragement of belligerence in many departments, including domestically, polarization and so on. So I think it's very important to look at that from a policy rather than campaign rhetoric perspective from the last administration, and also looking into the future, given that he may be a presidential candidate very soon. Whether that's from a prison cell or not remains to be decided.
Thank you very much. And Joe.
Okay. Yeah, my question is also for Rossen here. Pacifism has been around for a very long time. It's a very appealing position, and I'm drawn to it myself, constantly wondering why it has to be otherwise. How does one, however, after such a long period of pacifist thinking, in the light of these constant wars right down to the present and all of the destruction and the inability to stem that by pacifist positions, how does one defend that position, especially given the fact that at certain points in modern history, pacifist movements have actually interfered with realistic alternatives of deterrence against armaments and so on? Thank you.
Okay, so let's take those three questions.
Jump in on that, it's related.
Okay, fine, all right. In which case, let's take those four, and then we've probably got about 5-6 minutes to answer them. Fair enough.
Yeah, it just builds on what Marcia says, because, it seems that this association of the left with the national security state. I mean, we know that in the discussion.
You want mine?
So we know that in the discussion of Ukraine, many leftists are still blaming NATO, right? So you're talking about a moderate left Democratic Party, and then that seems rather circumstantial, right? That there's this alliance, again, because of the issue with Ukraine. And also, just finally, in what part of, how can we understand national security without the police, right? And I mean, right, Trump's and the Republicans' whole position on this, well, as we know, right, has been the opposite of, any kind of, they've been the ones pushing national security connection with the police. So it's just building on those points.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to go in the same order as the presentation. So Mark, followed by Alexis, followed by Rossen. Just to round up, you each have a minute, roughly speaking. Well, if you wanted to comment on anything, I know there wasn't a question directed to you, but I still give you the floor. If you don't want to take it, that's absolutely fine. You are free to choose to pass on the floor. But no, I just thought everyone gets a minute, and then we'll break for some coffee.
Okay, I'm going to have to go really quick then. So, Marcia, I guess we'll round it off later if we don't have a chance here. So, firstly, I mean, this question of Trump's dovishness, I mean, I think it's important to distinguish between what happens at domestic and international level and also what is the case for someone personally versus the practical large-scale effects of their actions. So it's no question Trump is a personally belligerent character. However, that's quite capable of having, effects that promote peace. I'm going to make a point which I wouldn't want to commit to print. It's sad it's being recorded, but I believe that Trump is genuinely a brilliant negotiator, actually far better than most the diplomatic corps. The methods of negotiation Trump brought in from the business world involved him doing things that people would seem crazy from the point of view of standard diplomacy, which is he would go and immediately threaten. I mean, I don't think he quite literally did this, but he would threaten countries really openly in a way he wouldn't normally do, and then he'd make peace with them. I mean, his diplomatic overtures in North Korea are a classic example of this. Also with China, he went in, did things in a completely different way, and actually it was his method of getting an agreement, and it's what he applied from the business world. Actually, probably the worst thing that Trump did from the point of view of the NatSec establishment was what he did with NATO, which is threatening to defund it. That was probably his biggest sin. And again, but that was a negotiating stratagem, I think.
His biggest sin.
Yeah, that's the thing they really couldn't forgive him for. But again, I think it was a negotiating strategy. It's like, I'll threaten to pull out all the troops out of Europe and get them to pay some more money from the European countries. I mean, I think actually what he did was quite sensible. I certainly think what he did in Syria was very dovish, which is that he was willing to, he did a little bit of bombing when there was a lot of pressure on him from the NatSec establishment, but he stopped there. There's no question, I think, that, it was at least very explicitly what the Democrats were saying. They wanted to go straight in with boots on the ground in a really full-on way. I should I know I've probably done the minute, but I should also say something to David's question. But actually, the police question is really interesting. I should go back and think about that because, of course, there is this very interesting militarization of the police, and I was excluding the police from what I'm talking about, but it is a really important question. And this goes back to something actually that Russell was saying the last time we were here, like in October. I don't think there's a significant body of the left who takes a pro-Russia position. I think that barely exists. Even most of the far left are on a pro-UK, pro-NATO line. So I think that's not true, basically, at that point, but we could argue about that.
Right. Thank you, Mark. Alexis?
I'll be very short to leave time to Rossen to answer more fully since he had more questions. About fake news, I think one of the elements of the discussion is also it is used within the context of a certain power relations between governing bodies and common citizen, and quite often the accusation of fake news is used to negate personal experience basis for public discussion. And in some circumstances, it's a perfectly legitimate negation, but in others, I think it's quite problematic. And I remember watching a documentary on the Vietnam War when an officer who was in the statistics office said, well, on the metrics, we were winning the war, so everyone who was telling us otherwise on the field was basically, either a traitor or something. Because on paper, we were winning. Everyone could have, opened the window and see that the Americans were losing. But that was my 2 cents.
Thank you very much, Alexis. Rossen, about a minute, if you can, or two at the very most.
Okay, thanks. For the first question, basically, critical thinking I do use in a very general sense, and I do use it also in the sense of the critical theorists, in the sense of people like Kant, Frankfurt School, post-structuralists, and others, but also I use it in the sense of the everyday, most trivial thinking that we do to solve the problems we face. I don't think that they are essentially the same, but they are identified in different perspectives. And I also think we should keep in mind that there's some sameness going on between critical thinking of the critical theorists and of the everyday problem solvers to simply reduce the gap between theory and practice. This is what I wanted to say on the first question. On the second question, I just want to say that I probably didn't emphasize this enough because I didn't have much time, but I wanted to say at some point that critical thinking has also a political aspect. And for that reason, because of this political aspect, I wanted to also insist on the necessity of political democracy as the political way in which critical thinking function in a contemporary society. And from there, let's say, a train or good critical thinkers will be able to identify the faults in fake news and in what their politicians are saying, and we will vote them out of office. Of course, we do not really necessarily live in democratic societies today. We know that, and we of course realize that it will be very difficult in authoritarian society to vote somebody out of office. But in the ideal case, I believe that when truth goes with goodness and justice, then it also goes to comes with democracy. At some point, critical thinking should reach the democracy, then social democracy, then environmental justice, and everything else that we think is very nice to have.
Well, great questions from our audience throughout the 90 minutes. You've done extremely well after lunch, so let's all go and have coffee, but let's first thank our three panelists.